Oh, rogue decks. Truly the marriage of competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! And casual Yu-Gi-Oh! The decks that can win at events, can do really well, but aren't necessarily the meta deck that you expect to see, and that's oftentimes their advantage. So, in today's video, I wanted to highlight 10 rogue decks that I think are really interesting, and as a bit of a change of pace, I'm actually going to be taking rogue decks that have been winning or topping at events, and I'll even include a link in the description to each of the decks that I mentioned. So when I explain them and I highlight them, you guys won't just be like, oh, okay, that sounds cool, how do I build it? There will literally be a deck list in the TCG Player Archive that I'm going to link to, so check that out. Okay, alright, let's get into it. 10 rogue decks. I'll start with a couple of boring ones just to get them out of the way, but all of the decks in this list, whether they're new or old, have changed in some capacity over the last few months, so I think it's worth sticking around to hear about them all. Alright, first, Altergeist. So this is a deck that lost multi-fakers. It lost 2 multi-fakers in the last ban list, but somehow or another it is still around. In fact, DZ, another YouTuber, he actually has been doing really well with this deck. He managed to get like top 4 at a UDS, he managed to get top 32 at YCS Portland, which is really crazy. Congrats to him. I didn't expect it, but I mean, here it is. So even though Multi-Faker isn't one, the deck still has a lot of ways to search the card out. If you choose to run Sangan and Salamangreat Almirage, that's one way of doing it, but there's still things like Meliseek into Link Karibo and just using personal spoofing. And all the advantages that Altergeist have already had pretty much still exist. If you take a look at his deck list, it's nothing that's like, completely out of the ordinary, but I do think that this deck has benefited a lot from just the return of, honestly, Solemn Judgment and other really recent powerful traps. Crackdown, of course, comes to mind. But I think that the triple Solemn Judgment means that this deck, once it kind of has your opponent locked up, is really a lot harder to break. And you still have access to the new things like Pot of Extravagance. You can run hand traps if you want to. I think that the biggest draw with this deck is that it's a control deck. And like it or not, right now Yu-Gi-Oh! Seems to kind of be moving in the direction of control. You want to have trap cards, you want to have cards that can stop your opponent's plays, and you want to have decks that can grind, and Altergeists, despite the recent nerfs in the ban list, are doing just that. Deck number 2, True Dracos, a deck that everyone kind of loves to hate. I mean, it's True Dracos, not a lot changes with this deck, really. I mean, it's kind of the same old thing. You've got these tribute summonable monsters, you get continuous spells and traps, you contribute continuous spells and traps to summon True Draco monsters. Honestly, what's interesting about this deck is I've always described it as like a deck that kind of just manages to it's like the kid in school who does a lot of really bad stuff but always manages to get away with it. Like, I never know what to think. Is like True Draco a broken deck? Because sometimes when you play against it, it feels that way. Like, a lot of these things don't have hard ones for turns, and the monsters can be pretty oppressive. But then on the other hand, it's not a perfect deck. It's very prone to the right types of spell and trap removal and that kind of thing. But yeah, you have really strong tools. Pot of Extravagance is one of the new ones that you can make use of if you want to, although I still don't like it because it locks you out of a lot of your other draw, search type effects. So really you'll just mostly be relying on Demise, Duality, Dragonic Diagram. A lot of people like to throw in Inspector Border, for instance, and if you want to run Monarch's Erupt, then you will want to have an empty extra deck. You can play this deck however you want. You can use Crackdown. Like Altergeist, Solemn Judgment makes it a lot better. So yeah, True Dracos, again, it's been topping a lot. Number 3 is Subterror Guru Control. So Subterror Guru, very long-awaited card. This deck's been out for a while now. It's been topping, periodically at events for a while now. It actually had a bit of a falling off this format, but it still has made some waves. I think the biggest nerf you could say that it's gotten is probably just losing Terraforming to 1. Because this deck does rely a lot on having copies of the Hidden City and being able to see it, so you can search Guru and search Fiendus and things like that. It is, that's kind of a big nerf, but then on the other hand, like with the other control decks on this list, they did get Solemn Judgment to 3. And when you're using Guru and Fiendus and other hand traps, plus Subterror, Final Battle, it actually can start to get really tough for your opponent to do things. Thing is though, this deck has always had a pretty big problem with just things like Twin Twisters, hitting a lot of the back row cards, Heavy Storm Duster as well. Now that you have Solemn Judgment, you don't have to even rely on something like Dark Bribe to stop your opponent from destroying all your back row. Solemn Judgment does a better job of it without giving your opponent the extra card. Other than that though, this deck hasn't changed a lot. I mean, it's the same old story. Pot of Duality, Pot of Extravagance, Pot of Desires if you want, lots of different ways to get to the card that you need, and a lot of hand traps to ram down your opponent's throat. They don't want to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Anymore. Okay, so the rest of the list gets a little bit more interesting. Next, we've got the Grin Majide deck. Now, you guys probably heard about the Grin Majide deck. It actually got second place at YCS Portland. That was huge. It was a very big, innovative take on the deck that basically used Golden Castle of Stromberg and its banishing effect, as well as like the kind of like attack stopping and ability to summon stuff like Hextrude from the deck. But you can play this deck in a more traditional fashion with more anti-meta cards if you want to. I've actually seen a build that managed to top that uses the more usual suspects: Thunder King, Inspector Border, Fossil Dyna, Jalgan the Spiritualist, those types of cards. And this deck has gotten a few new tools to work with. So Grin Majide has always existed as a very, very rogue strategy, but it's kind of become more of a spotlight thing because it's just more consistent. If you want, you can run any variety of pot cards, Desires, Extravagance if you like. There's also Gizmek Orochi that came out in Rising Rampage, a card that I honestly was thinking when I first saw it, I was like, yeah, this is definitely going to be used. It's a beat stick, it powers up your Grin Majide, and you can run it at 3. It's very easy to summon and bring out from the graveyard. So this deck that I'm actually building myself, I like the castle kind of version of it, but either way works. Alright, so the next deck is Necrons. Now, Necrons recently got 2 Shrit instead of 1 on the last ban list, so that's a pretty big deal. Shrit does improve the deck's consistency and advantage, kind of gaining a lot. So basically it means that you are able to search your Warrior Necrons monsters a lot more often. That's your Bryonyx, that's your Clazolis. But this deck, even before then, had a lot going for it. Because of Necrons of Unicorn, you can shut out extra deck monsters effects entirely, which is really pretty strong against links and just a lot of boards. It means that, you know, if you're able to go first with Necrons, you might be able to make a board where your opponent may not really be able to rely on their extra deck to stop it. And the Necrons monsters, I think, are designed so well because they don't really get entirely power crept. Yes, hand traps like Ash Blossom hurt the deck a lot, but it's still extremely consistent. Thanks to, of course, Preparation of Bryce being at 3, things like the incantations, and the ability to use Cyber Angel Benton and actually search out Vanity's Ruler, because you can lock your opponent up pretty well, and you do have a lot of plays as well. And I think that, like a lot of the earlier decks in this list, it benefits largely from being a control deck in a format that is gradually slowing down and having to deal with things like Nibiru that we all just love. Okay, so one that really surprised me was actually Lair Infernoids. Now, this is a deck that has popped up in like years past. You know, when Lair of Darkness first released, using it with Infernoids was kind of one of the strategies that was very popular. It's easy to search Lair of Darkness. Even though Terraforming went to 1, you already have access to Arima, plus the Terraforming, so getting to Lair is not a hard thing to do. You can use Lilith to actually search Void Feast, which is kind of the power trap for this archetype. Thanks to Pot of Extravagance, which seems to be popping up a lot on this list. Thanks to Pot of Extravagance, this deck does get access to a lot more draw power that Infernoids will never say no to. And yeah, you know, being able to tribute your opponent's monsters as a quick effect, even though it's only once, thanks to Lair of Darkness, this is a pretty strong strategy, and it managed to actually top at a regional, so it was something that I was just like, wow, I didn't know this could still do this in this current climate of Yu-Gi-Oh! So I definitely think you guys should take a look at the list linked below. So next is Cresselia. Now, Cresselia, it's a tough one to include on a list because like it gets teched into a lot of different things, but the actual kind of age-old Cresselia Kaiju OTK deck is basically the deck that actually has been doing a lot of work. There is a list that managed to top a regional, and it's pretty much what you expect. Cruselias don't have like loads of new tools right now, but they do have multiple copies of Interrupted Kaiju Slumber, a card that I think, you know, it can be a big surprise for opponents. It's like a dark hole, but it actually leads to an OTK for your opponent, and you guys know what Cruselias do. They summon, you know, Equimax and even sometimes Avramax, and just kind of like kill your opponent really fast. It's an OTK deck in a world where OTK decks technically are becoming less and less common, since we see things like Salamangrates and Sky Strikers at the top tables right now, more so than like decks that are just outright killing you. I think that this is a strategy that makes a lot of sense. And all the Cresselia cards did recently get reprinted in holo rarities, so it's a pretty good deck to play. The next one is a favorite of mine, Mech Knight Invoked. So this is one that just kind of fell off the competitive map over the last few years, although it was never really a bad deck. So you're using Alistair the Invoker, of course, and the Invocation Engine alongside Mech Knights, which make for a deck that does really well going second. The Mech Knight monsters want your opponent to have things in their zones, or their columns rather, so that you can summon them easily. And of course, Blue Sky and Indigo Eclipse are kind of the backbone of this strategy. You can throw in World Legacy Memory and those types of things to make this strategy work even better, if you ask me. But there are other things that have changed with this deck. The two mainly being Dino Wrestler Pankratops and Phantasme. Phantasme is still very expensive, so you know, if you have it, play it. If you don't, it's eh. But these cards help this deck going second even more. It was already a really great deck that kind of needed to be going second, but what seems to be happening is that we're kind of losing hand traps in favor of running things like Pankratops, things like Phantasme, even more Mech Knights, like the list that I'm going to be linking in the description. It ran more Mech Knights than usual, because normally you might run just like, you know, 3 Blue Sky and like 2 Purple Knight or something, and that's the whole list. He ran several more than that. And of course, thanks to things like Nibiru and thanks to things like Dark Ruler No More, going second's kind of never been easier. So the next deck is Paleozoic Frogs, a deck that's been around for quite a while and has kind of been in and out of the meta as a rogue thing. Thanks to the recent Trap Trick reprint, I think that this is finally a deck that more people can play, because that was largely the price prohibitive card, although Totally Awesome's got a bit of a price tag too. But yeah, you can now get, you know, copies of Trap Trick very easily, and that makes this deck a lot of fun to play. The deck that I am actually highlighting here ran Fiend Griefing alongside Absolute King Backjack, which lets you basically stack your deck and guarantee that you'll be able to set a trap card directly from the top of your deck. This is extremely strong, and of course it makes using your Paleozoic monsters even easier. And the Frog engine, it's something that it's not going to really get power crept very easily. You know, Swap Frog doesn't have hard once returns. It's super easy to just use him and make a Totally Awesome. And Totally Awesome is one of those old negation cards that doesn't have a hard once return on it either. So, you know, it can get a little bit oppressive. This deck can even be combined with Marincess if you wanted to have another way to make some more link monsters, but you don't even have to do that. I think Marincess, speaking of them, will probably get a little bit better as more support comes out, closer to Chaos Impact. But for now, this deck seems to still be managing to stay on top, and you've even got another Solemn Judgment to play with, so I see why it's working. And the final deck on the list is going to be Spirals. So this is one that always manages to surprise me when it wins, because it seems like there's always so many different ways to play this deck. Spirals kind of infamously had a tier 0 format. It only lasted a few weeks, but it was definitely there. It's not nearly that strong now, but the thing is, the deck has still managed to top regionals. The specific list that you can find in the description actually was very different. I was expecting it to use something like Dangers and kind of link ladder a lot, but more so it focuses on the main deck Spiral monsters. Things like equipping Last Resort to Sleeper, and just things like using Master Plan and Spiral Resort itself. There are some new tools. It actually runs Pot of Extravagance, which was a huge surprise to me. I always thought that the extra deck would be like a valuable asset that you wouldn't want to get rid of, but this is a deck that worked for him. It still uses things like Spiral Rescue Mission, which is actually my favorite trap. I really love that card. And, you know, the Nightmare Suite, those types of things. Spirals still managed to be just fine. So, yeah, if you're interested in building it, it's a deck that's not too tough to get a hold of and doesn't seem to have too many expensive cards. That's kind of the trim of a lot of these things with all the reprints happening right now. So give it a look. And those are the 10 rogue decks of the format. So even though Yu-Gi-Oh! Is in a peculiar place right now where it's like we have a new format, but it's still a lot of the same decks winning, it doesn't mean that the rogue territory isn't changing and getting a little bit more exciting. A lot of these decks are familiar faces, but some of them do have new tools. And like I said at the beginning, these are real decks that are actually topping regionals, so if any of them sound interesting to you, check out the links in the description so that you can see the deck list for yourself. And speaking of TCG Player and its deck list archive, if you want to ever buy any cards, if you are maybe building these decks, use the Team APS TCG Player link in the description. If you buy something there, then we get a small kickback and no extra expense to you. So it's much appreciated. I think in the next video, I'll maybe talk about some fun recent decks that have been releasing that I just haven't been able to really talk about because I haven't been making that many videos. So yeah, subscribe and I'll see you guys in the next video where maybe we'll talk about those instead. All right, that's all I've got to say. Pass turn.